On this day, 210 years ago, an embarrassing display took place. After Napoleon lost, with Denmark being its ally, and Great Britain won, with Sweden being its ally, Sweden for their rewards was given Norway, which was part of Denmark. Norway didn't like it, Denmark didn't like it, so they staged an embarrassing war lasting only 20 days, where they got their ass whooped. And Norway was then forced into a personal union with Sweden, which would last almost 100 years. Now, talking about some embarrassing 20 days, in this expansion coming, we have a problem, or rather, players have found a problem with what's happening. So in this shiny timeline, we are here right now. By the way, in a few days, we will be getting the Radiant Echoes event, which is, the freebie catch-up gear before the release of an expansion as usual. After the release, either early access or the global launch, you have a couple of weeks to get yourself accustomed to the expansion, the new features, etc., level, multiple characters and whatnot, and then Season 1 begins. However, this time we have a change. The change is that Mythic Raid opens on the 17th, together with Mythic Plus, which isn't even mentioned here anywhere. That's where players realize, hold on a second, if Mythic Plus opens on the 17th and the early access is on the 22nd, that's 27 days without Mythic Plus. From the moment I log in and I start leveling in the expansion, I know I have to wait 27 days before I can get into Mythic Plus. That's the question for today. How and why is this happening, and is this better or worse than what we used to have? So on a trip down memory lane, these were the releases of the seasons from the release of Shadowlands to the release of Dragonflight to then the following seasons of Dragonflight. Now in the following seasons after the release of an expansion, you might be of course aware of this, you only had to wait 1 week. You had the off-season, pre-season week where nothing much was happening, and then the week after that, you would get everything at once. Normal Raid, Heroic Raid, Mythic Raid, and Mythic Plus fully open. This was in Amidrasil, it was also in Aberrus. In the release of Dragonflight, it was slightly different. You had 2 weeks of pause instead of 1. You all remember, perhaps, the Wikora you were using for your world tour of hunting for rares every day, hoping to get one of the high item level pieces of gear from them. Maybe some of you even remember or are embarrassed by their degenerate grind they did with some of these factions, just for a little crumb of an extra higher item level piece. But then, after the first couple of weeks doing your full world tour of Mythic Zeros once a week per character, right? That's when the raid would open. Normal, Heroic and Mythic Raid, and then also Mythic Plus all together all at once. Now, it was not always like this. This was an addition for the last season of Shadowlands, for Sepulchre, which then carried on in Dragonflight. At the release of Shadowlands, but also the previous expansions, it was different. You had 1 extra buffer week. Between the first couple of weeks of leveling, which is the same thing we had in Dragonflight, the first couple of weeks of, nothing much going on, you had an extra week. You had the week where normal and heroic raid would open, but not mythic. And you also had the week where Mythic Plus keys would open, but not at full item level rewards. They would have an item level capped. Generally speaking, usually it was a +10. This was because +10 was similar to heroic gear item level. So obviously Blizzard didn't want you to get into Mythic Plus out gearing the gear from Mythic or getting even better gear than heroic, higher bosses, and making those raids useless. So they would cap Mythic Plus for a week. And that's where we are getting back to in this expansion. In this expansion, after the early access and then the global release, you still have the 2 weeks of leveling, the 2 weeks of peace and calm and quiet, and then you have the season start, which only has normal and heroic raid, with Mythic opening the week after. So Mythic Plus gets fully opened the week of the Mythic raid. However, there is a difference this expansion, because halfway through Dragonflight we got this. We got the first 10 Mythic Plus key levels squished into Mythic 0. So now the rebalance is that the Mythic +2 key levels are much harder. They start at a much higher level because Mythic 0 is now the equivalent in difficulty of a +10. So what changes in the War Within is that in the buffer week, where only normal and heroic raid are open, and previously Mythic Plus keys would be open, but just at limited item level. So they wouldn't go all the way up to the max item level and max Great Vault. They would instead be capped at a lower level to prevent you from, outgearing the raids and Mythic Raid, which wasn't even open at the time, etc, etc. However, the difference is, of course, that now you don't have Mythic Plus. You have Mythic Zero dungeons, because Mythic Zero dungeons are the equivalent of a plus 10 now. So this might as well read as Mythic plus 10. If it was the older system before this rework, then this would be a Mythic plus 10 capped key level. There is a problem with this change though. The problem is that, number one, by doing Mythic Zero dungeons rather than Mythic Plus, you are not getting rating. You're not getting any progression in your Mythic Plus rating. Number two, even though the gear was locked in Mythic Plus at the beginning of an expansion, that didn't stop you from continuing to climb. And continuing to climb, for example, meant you could be able to get a key level on the next reset from the Great Vault at a higher level, right? So even if the gear was locked at 6, you could farm a whole bunch of 6 because that's when the gear item level would stop. But then you could go for a push key at plus 16, so that the next week, the next reset, you would get a plus 15 key ready to go. You cannot push higher key levels even if the loot from the chests was locked. Nothing stopped you from collecting higher Great Vault loot, because you could do a whole bunch of plus 14s to get a 226 from the Great Vault. Nothing forced you just because Mythic Plus gear from the chest was locked here and getting this item level from the Great Vault. Nothing stopped you from just going higher and then getting this reward from the Great Vault, which will not be possible with Mythic Zero dungeons. And then of course there is the fact that still Mythic Zero dungeons are still not Mythic Plus, so you're not getting any affixes. You're not getting your timer, your affixes, and getting used to and accustomed to all of the dangers of Mythic Plus with the extra addition of the affixes. So yes, it is a loss. With this change of extending one more week before Mythic Raid opens and Mythic Plus opens, it would have been just the same as what we got in Shadowlands, but we have two changes. Number one, you have the early access, so you already have some 5 extra days before the first week actually happens, and then you have to wait 2 more weeks of leveling. So now it's like 19, 20 almost days, and then an extra 7 days of the first week without Mythic Plus, so now you're up at 27 days before Mythic Plus opens. Now, in terms of time, in terms of activity, and in terms of loot and actual gear, this is not worse though. Don't treat the War Within Mythic Zero dungeons as the dungeons from Dragonflight or even from Shadowlands. That's because those Mythic Zero dungeons were on a weekly cooldown. So in the first 2 weeks, all you could do was one of these per week per character. But in the War Within, they have a daily lockout, not a weekly lockout. So technically, whenever you try to look up one of these guides and one of these, what to do every day, the list of the things you have to do, etc., etc., for the War Within, it's gonna be 8 Mythic Zero dungeons, not per week, but per day. So if you have, for example, very possible, considering you have 2 weeks of nothing, even with the early release, you're gonna have like 20 days of nothing, leveling 2 characters, even 3 characters maybe. Well, if you have 3 characters, now your chores in this week are going to be 24 Mythic Zero dungeons per day. So definitely in terms of time and in terms of activity, you're not losing anything. If anything, it's getting even more crowded in this week with the amount of Mythic Zero dungeons you will have to do per character. The other point is gear, loot. Because this might matter to many players. Yeah, but okay, I don't care if it's spelled Mythic Zero instead of Mythic Plus. What about the actual gear I can get from these dungeons? Well, the result is still positive because Mythic Zero will give Veteran 4 gear. Veteran 4 gear can be upgraded all the way up to Veteran 8, which is 606 item level, which is the equivalent of a Mythic Plus 6 piece of gear and a mid-tier normal level boss. For comparison, the absolute max Mythic Plus gear from the dungeon chest is gonna be 613. So you will be about 6-7 item levels below what you will be looting from the chests of Mythic Plus as Mythic Plus opens. Now, the other positive is that you will be spending useless crests that you otherwise would not have used. We're all familiar with how useless Whelpling and Drake crests became after just 1 or 2 weeks in the expansion because your gear was getting so high that the only ones you cared about were worms and then aspect crests. And this expansion, it will be the same. They have a different name, but you can tell them apart by the color. It's the same thing. The Whelpling and the Drake crests is what you will need to upgrade Mythic 0 gear, and is not what you will need to upgrade Mythic Plus gear or Raid gear, which means it will be practically free for you to upgrade the Mythic gear from Veteran 4 to Veteran 8, because you're not spending any of the crests you will need for the actual, good stuff, the actual good gear you will loot. So also in terms of gear rewards, it's good, but also possibly even better. What I say by being better is that being a Mythic 0 dungeon, you have no timer, you cannot fail the key, you cannot get less items from the end of dungeon chest because you're out of time. This one is loot boss by boss, just like any other normal or heroic dungeon. So it is definitely easier for you to get loot in these Mythic 0 dungeons. And the loot itself is pretty good. So in short, after these changes that are extending the release of Mythic Raid together with the Mythic Plus dungeon by an extra week, compared to what we have been used to in the last tier of Sepulchre and then all of Dragonflight practically. The major negative of this will be that Mythic 0 dungeons will not give you rating, will not allow you to start with a higher Mythic Plus key at the beginning of the season, because you can't get a higher key level from Mythic 0, and won't allow you to get higher item level rewards from the Great Vault by doing higher Mythic Plus key levels, because Mythic Plus is simply not there. And then lastly, the minor point of being able to get used to the affixes of Mythic Plus, the timer of the different dungeons in Mythic Plus, which is not gonna be available for Mythic 0 dungeons. But in terms of number one, the item level and the quantity of rewards, Mythic 0 dungeons are gonna be just equal, if not slightly better, than your typical first week at capped item level, like we used to have since Shadowlands. And number two, in terms of activity, in terms of how busy can you be, it's gonna be also equal, if not higher, depending on how many characters you have. And likely, to be fair, this is also made somewhat worse by the first time addition of an early release. Because if you get an early release 4 days earlier, but nothing really is happening for the first 2 weeks, then it's gonna feel like an even longer wait before Mythic Plus actually opens. Because if none of this existed, if no early release was a thing and you simply had week 1 of nothing, week 2 of nothing, first week of Mythic Plus capped, and then Mythic Plus opens fully when Mythic Raid opens, would have been just the same as this from Shadowlands. Yes, with the difference that you have Mythic 0 dungeons instead of Mythic Plus, which you already mentioned. But possibly things are made to feel slightly worse because of the extra, 6 days before the actual release of the expansion, between the early release and even the global release, which comes on Monday, which is, for example, a couple of days before EU normal reset. So this is exactly what will happen, or rather, what are the implications of having Mythic Plus coming out almost a month after the release of the expansion. Part of it is influenced by the early access, giving you some extra 5 days, making it feel even longer for you before getting into the actual Mythic Plus. Part of it is because 1 week is now Mythic 0 instead of being Mythic Plus. So all of this is stretching the time that you have to wait before Mythic Plus actually comes out. I still think it won't be that bad, unless you are a complete Mythic Plus junkie that gets off on playing 30 Mythic Plus keys and needs to have a timer in a dungeon to feel good, then I don't think it will be that bad. Anyways, this was the recap of exactly what is happening in the first month of the release of the expansion, and the whys and the hows we are getting such a delay from the first week of Mythic Plus becoming available. So, for today, on this Friday, we are now leaving each other. Thanks, of course, as usual, to everyone who has been watching the video, as well as supporting for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching, see you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I'm not even annoyed by any of this. What annoys me more about the release of this expansion is coming out in summer. It's just too hot, man. Make it come out in October.